My name is Doug Erber, and I'm president of the Japan-America Society. Our current chairman, Glenn Hamakawa, is a partner at the international accounting firm Ernst & Young, and he regrets he couldn't be here today, but Glenn asked me to read his greeting on his behalf. So pretend I'm Glenn. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. This year, the Japan-America Society of Southern California is celebrating its 109th anniversary. We are a membership organization dedicated to building meaningful relationships among Japanese and Americans. We accomplish this mission by offering a wide variety of programs, such as today's Japan Update Symposium, our annual Women's Leadership Counts Conference, and many other business, public affairs, and educational programs. I'd like to thank and recognize those who made today's event possible, especially our co-presenting partners, the Japan Business Association of Southern California, Town Hall Los Angeles, and Sister Cities International. Japan Update Symposium also benefited from generous support from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Japan through the Consulate General of Japan in Los Angeles, Sasakawa Peace Foundation, the National Association of Japan-America Societies, Sanders Charitable Trust, and, of course, this wonderful luxury hotel, the Intercontinental Los Angeles Century City at Beverly Hills. I would like to extend a special appreciation to Consul General Akira Chiba. Since his posting in Los Angeles a year and a half ago, he has made a strong and positive impact and has supported many organizations in the community, including the Japan-America Society. Consul General Chiba, thank you. Finally, I would like to thank those of you who took advantage of the bundled registration fee, which included this event's admission and a new one-year membership. For everyone who paid the non-member fee to attend, you can save $50 and become a new member of the Japan-America Society as we're extending the bundled offer today. Please see our staff at the registration table in the foyer where you can join as a new Japan-America Society member for only $25. Thank you, and please enjoy the symposium. Representing our Japan Update Symposium's partnering organization is the president of the Japan Business Association of Southern California. Please welcome the Senior Vice President and General Manager of Mitsubishi Corporation Americas, Mr. Hitoshi Ishikawa.
Thank you, Doug. Good afternoon. I'm Hitoshi Ishikawa, President of Japan Business Association of Southern California, JBA, this year. On behalf of JBA, I would like to thank everyone for your participation today. It is a great honor for us to be a sponsor for this great event with Japan-American Society of Southern California. The agenda of today's symposium is U.S.-Japan Economic Alliance and Japan's national security environment. Although the Trump administration's evaluation may vary, it is apparent that the current U.S.-Japan relationship is very good as never before. This may be caused by the personal relationship between President Trump and Prime Minister Abe, but I believe this is just a partial reason. JBA was established in 1960 and has almost 450 Japanese-related companies. It is one of the largest Japanese business organizations in the United States now. Our mission is to develop and improve the business environment for Japanese companies in Southern California through strengthening ties with the local community, membership services, and educational support activities. One of the typical examples of our activities is U.S. Educators to Japan, USEJ. This program has been continued more than 40 years, and 539 U.S. educators have been sent to Japan and experienced its educational scene. This should make U.S. common people understand Japan more deeply. Over the last half-century, JBA has been deepening mutual understandings between Southern California and Japan, like this case, and has been committed to promote business and people-to-people exchanges in many areas. I believe this kind of grassroots activities must be one of the factors of the current very good relationship between the United States and Japan. Japan-America Society of Southern California has always supported JBA, and we have collaborated in these grassroots activities as well. Today, I'm very excited to have the chance to hear the professional opinions about the current U.S.-Japan relationship, especially from the economical and national security point of view. let's put the grassroots aside and go into the political aspect today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Ishikawa. He was recognized earlier, but it's my great honor now to introduce the highest-ranking Japanese governmental official assigned to our region. He's an individual who's worked tirelessly to support our organization and many other important Japanese and Japanese-American organizations in Southern California and Arizona. Please welcome the Consul General of Japan to Los Angeles, the Honorable Akira Chiba.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and I regret that I'm rather lowly, despite the fact that I'm introduced as the highest, but still I do represent my government here in Southern California and Arizona, so I'd like to, on behalf of my government, say a couple of words. I'd like to thank Ambassador Schiefer for coming here all the way from Washington, D.C. To join us today, to share his views on U.S.-Japan relations. And I'd like to also recognize all the distinguished guests. It's my great pleasure for me to be here for Japan Update, U.S.-Japan Economic Alliance and Japan's national security environment. I'd like to acknowledge the Japan-America Society of Southern California, the Japan Business Association of Southern California, and Town Hall Los Angeles for presenting today's symposium, and for their ongoing role in building meaningful relationships between Japan and the United States. The good news always is that the Japan-U.S. partnership is stronger than ever. Prime Minister Abe and President Donald Trump have met on 5 occasions already, and they have spoken on phone 18 times so far. In fact, ever since President Trump took office, he and the Japanese Prime Minister have talked to each other at a pace of around twice a month, a clear indication that the bilateral cooperation between our two nations is of utmost importance. Now, that is not the cause of the very good relationship. This is the result of the very good relationship, because Japan is a constructive partner in the economic relationship with the United States, and nowhere is this more apparent than right here in Southern California. Overall, Japan is this region's largest foreign investor, with over 2,400 enterprises in Southern California, creating nearly 80,000 direct jobs and supporting over 181,000 jobs in total. Therefore, developments in and around Japan may have implications on both domestic and global fronts. For a region like Southern California, which is so closely tied to events on the other side of the Pacific, what happens in Japan can have a significant impact here and vice versa. The Consulate General of Japan in Los Angeles will continue to build on efforts to promote new initiatives that highlight Japan. Last year saw the soft opening of Japan House, a project launched by the Minister of Foreign Affairs that aims to showcase Japan's art, culture, science, technology, tourism, entertainment, food, and much, much more. Japan House is located in Hollywood and Highland and currently has an art exhibition and a shop in operation, with other parts of the facility, including an event space and restaurant, opening later this year. Japan House hopes to further spur understanding and appreciation of Japan through a wide variety of programming. It will be truly a house of inspiration. Lastly, I'd like to emphasize that symposia and other events presented by the Japan-America Society, the Japan Business Association, and Town Hall Los Angeles, such as the one today, are essential for promoting dialogues, and I greatly appreciate their contribution in this way. Thank you very much for letting me join, and please enjoy your day.
Thank you, Consul General. Next up is our panel. All of our speakers' biographies are included in your program, so in the interest of time, we will only announce the speakers' titles and their affiliation when they're introduced. It's my pleasure to introduce the panel's moderator, who will introduce the experts on the panel. She is the Los Angeles Bureau Chief of NHK, and she is a past senior economics correspondent for NHK's Washington, D.C. News Bureau. Please welcome Kaori Ida.
Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Japan Update. It's a great pleasure and honor to be moderating this session. I think we gathered today at a very, very interesting and important moment. Just from a news perspective today, there was two major news coming out from Seoul and Washington, D.C. We learned today that South Korea's President Moon had called President Trump to convey his intention to send a special envoy to North Korea. And what implications will that have on Japan and the U.S. is something we'd like to discuss. Also, we heard from the president today that he has decided to impose harsh tariffs on imported steel. That would be something that would have implications on Japan and maybe trigger a trade war. So we have a wonderful panel today, very distinguished panelists, and I'd like to introduce them very briefly. In the middle is Lieutenant General Koichi Bansho, the former commanding general of the Japan Ground Self-Defense Force and currently senior advisor to the Marubeni Corporation. And we have to my immediate right is Professor Toshihiro Nakayama, professor of Faculty of Policy Management at Keio University and adjunct fellow at the Japan Institute of International Affairs. And last but not least, on my far right is Mr. Matthew Goodman, Senior Advisor for Asian Economics at CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies. I've asked the three panelists to briefly, maybe 10 to 15 minutes, talk about their assessment on what's happening between the US and Japan. And then we'll have a conversation on the podium. And after that, I'd like to open up the floor to questions. So please have your questions ready. And without further ado, Mr. Bansho, General Bansho, I'm sorry.
Please look at the slide. This year, 2018, is the 150 years anniversary of the Meiji Restoration. And at the time, as you know, Commodore Perry knocked the door to Japan to end the Tokugawa shogunate and to open the new era. And we have a very good story between United States and Japan. For example, that the exchange of the flowers. As you know, cherry blossom along the Potomac River was donated from Tokyo mayor. And in turn, dogwood flower was presented from the United States to Japan. So in spring, cherry blossom, and after the cherry blossom, dogwood flower was bloomed. So that is, I think that is also a good US-Japan history. And also we have a exchange of the disaster relief operation on the beginning of the 20th century. 1906, San Francisco earthquake was happened, and the Japanese people donated and supported. And in turn, on 1923, Great Kanto earthquake was happened. Immediately, US Navy fleet and the US citizens donated and supported many supplies and to open the field hospitals also. So this is a very wonderful story, but we had very tragic days and the severe days on 1940s. But this picture was taken on 3 years ago. I participated in the ceremony of the Iwo Jima, the 70th anniversary. I was really impressed because Japanese soldiers and the US Marines stood up together and respect the victims and respect the soldiers and the Marines together and confirm the importance of the peace and our security relationship. Now, after the war, Korean War happened in 1950, and at the time, Japan National Police Reserve was organized. That is the origin of our self-defense forces. For many years, Japan was concentrated on the mission of the national defense. But after the Cold War, we started the international missions such as the participation to minesweeping operation in Persian Gulf after the Gulf War in 1991, and our ground troops sent to Cambodia as a peacekeepers in 1992, and global on terrorism after 2001. This is me on 2004, I was assigned as a commander of the first contingent to Iraq. So we deployed to Iraq just 14 years ago. Today, I raised this national flag on Samoa. 14 years ago, February 28th, March 1st, I arrived at Samoa and raised our national flag. So we participated in such kind of operation. And it's me also. We conducted the humanitarian assistance missions, rehabilitation of the infrastructures, and to support the peoples, like this. But at the time, I dearly appreciate the US-Japan security cooperation because before our deployment, many soldiers and Marines visited my camp to observe our training and to observe our preparation for deployment. They taught us many things, true lesson learned. So we are very, very appreciated. And during the operation, of course, we had many close relationship between US Armed Forces and us. Another one is my experiences is the Tomodachi operation. As you know, 2011, we had a very severe earthquake in Tohoku areas. That is, I think there is two campaigns, such as to cope with the tsunami and the earthquake. Another campaign is to cope with the nuclear power plant incident, like this, to search and rescue the victims, and cooling of a nuclear power plant by water, by choppers. But at the time, Tomodachi operation was conducted by US Armed Forces. Tomodachi means, as you know, that the friendship. But I was really pleased that the US Armed Forces named Tomodachi in Japanese. So we felt many things. More than 20,000 American service men and women rushed to Japan to support them. For example, this is the opening of the Sendai Airport. Sendai Airport was truly damaged by the tsunami, but quickly US forces supported us to open that airport, and that was utilized for the rescue base. And this is also conducted by US Marines from Okinawa. They opened and rescued the remote island to save their lives. And this kind of activities was conducted together. And sometimes US soldiers, Marines, sailors, airmen and women encouraged small children with music also. And SHIBORF, that is the special expertise group for chemical, biological, and radiation. They came to Japan to support us in order to cope with the nuclear facility incident. In those days, we really think that your cooperation from support from US Armed Forces and American citizens was great pleasure and great confidence. And also we learned that to prepare for the worst and hope for the best. Now, this is a history, but I'd like to talk about the current situation. Look at the Japan's security environment a little bit. This is a picture of Japan archipelago. Historically and geopolitically, we are facing to the three challenges from north and middle and south. This is the Cold War situation. We call it the Nordic chronology because during the Cold War, US-Soviet Union confrontation was happening in the north. So in the European front, Barents Sea, on north of the Scandinavian Peninsula, and Asian front was the Sea of Okhotsk, and the Northern Pacific was very important. But nowadays, this situation will be changing and expanding from not only for north, but also south areas and the middle areas is very important. I painted a red color. That is the East China Sea and the South China Sea, because of the North Korean situation and the Chinese expenditures. First, I'd like to talk about North Korea. This is a range of the missiles. Many kind of the missiles and conventional weapons they are demonstrating. Those are the series of the missiles and launched many times. This is the last launch of the Hwasong 15, that is the Mars 15th, largest and the longest missiles. I'm very sorry, but that is in Japanese, but they launched several times. Hwasong 14th, that is a kind of the ICBM, intercontinental ballistic missiles. They launched the lofted shooting. Its distance is not so far, but the hours, flight hours, is more than 40 minutes to 50 minutes. That is equivalent to the ICBMs. And the last missiles, Hwasong 15s, if they launch the normal range, maybe it extends to the 13,000 kilometers. So maybe until the corners, of course, and maybe near to the New York and Washington, D.C. So they are now developing this kind of the capabilities. And moreover, they are developing the nuclear capabilities. And especially last September 3rd, they tested the hydrogen bombs, 150 kilotons. That is a huge capabilities. So we are very, very concerned about that. And this is a new level of the threat for us. In order to cope with that kind of the situation, we are now conducting the joint operation for deterrent. This is a very unique pictures. 3 US carriers deployed to the Sea of Japan. I think that is the really unusual operation with Japanese fleet. And also, American B-1 strategic bombers and Japanese fighters conducting the joint training in order to deter the North Korean situation. Recently, Pyeongchang Olympic was opened, and at the opening ceremony, your Vice President and our Prime Minister attended that opening ceremony and had a trilateral meeting with President Moon. But at the same time, the Kim Jong-un's sister and high-ranking officials of the North Korea attended. And many complex situations happened. But we never forget what is the core of this North Korean issue. What is the center of gravity of the North Korean issue? Maybe we will talk later, but I think we never forget that the core of this issue is North Korea would like to have the nuclear capabilities and long-range missile to transport it. So this is the core of this issue. And we never afford it. We never accept it because that is a violation of the NPT framework, and we have not to allow to suffer such kind of the threat so far. Now, I'd like to talk now about China a little bit. This is a figure of the Chinese defense expenditures. Last around 30 years, they increased their budget around 40 times. And before the 10 years, they increased 3 times. And as of the last year's budget, their budget is 3.5 of Japanese defense expenditures. And based on such kind of the expenditure and effort, this figure is very interesting. Upper red figure that suddenly increased, that is the 2012. Japan declared the nationalization of the Senkaku Islands. At the time, their numbers of the invasion of the Japanese territorial water was drastically increased. And another figure, that is the interception of our Air Force to defend our air zone. From 1958 to now, for 60 years. The middle of that mountain is 1984, during the Cold War. The number was the highest, 944 times. But nowadays, last year's number was the highest, 1,168 times. That is the historical numbers. And during the Cold War, 944, almost 90% of scrambles was occupied by the anti-Soviet Soviet aircraft. But nowadays, around 70% of that aircraft is from China. And submarines, warships, and any kind of aircraft. And this is the South China Sea. So it's kind of the reef was changed to artificial island, and China is making 7 artificial islands like this. And Russia is also developing their military capabilities and the modernization. So that's why this cartoon made by me, enlarging China and Brazil and unstable North Korea, and the revival of their capabilities of the Russia. It's a situation of the East Asia right now. This is, I think that is a kind of the deja vu of the end of the 19th century. And we have to pay attention to another threat and risks, such as the cybers, space, or massive destruction, so WMDs, or volcano, such kind of the national disasters or pandemics. So what is Japan strategy? So our mission is to defend our land. This is a main mission, homeland defense, from north to south. And also, we have to cope with the disaster relief operation and the international missions. But most important thing for us is to strengthen the defense posture along the southwestern areas, because to cope with Peninsula and East China Sea. So we have several measures to establish the new camps and to upgrade the traffic or maneuver capabilities, and to strengthen the amphibious capabilities. This is a figure that we are now going to put the new camps along the Ryukyu Islands. And we are now conducting the development of amphibious capabilities like this. And we will introduce Osprey, 17th Osprey, and we will introduce AAV for the amphibious vehicle. For example, the top of the man is me. And as of the US-Japan security relationship, I think there is a very, very good relations now, based on the security arrangement, based on the guidelines, based on the leadership. And as a military, we are conducting the very good relations. And we developed many good relations, such as the conducting joint exercises like this, and actual HADR operations. And this is my kind of the conclusion. To look at the areas of the Indo-Pacific areas, hard balancing is located at the Japan archipelago. US and Japan must be combined to cope with the situation. But in the South or Southeast Asian countries and South Asia, soft balancing might be very important to establish the maritime security or HADR or capacity building. Such kind of the things might be very important. And also, Japan, US, and Australia, India, such kind of the countries to be shared the values might be combined. This picture was 3 years ago. Prime Minister Abe made a speech at the Congress, and sent an old general, as General Snowden. He was a veteran of the Iwo Jima. And shake hand another gentleman is Mr. Shindo. He's a grandson of General Kuribayashi, who is the Supreme Commander of the defending force of Japanese Imperial Army. Shake hand, the historical moment. So we have to think to develop our security relationship. Our common values should be developed and improve perception gap and promote mutual respect. This is my last slide. During the Tomodachi operation, I was assigned to the chief of a bilateral coordination center on behalf of the Self-Defense Force. And the center officer was Admiral Walsh. He was the commanding admiral, four-star admiral, to conduct all U.S. forces. And the left-hand side, General Field was the commanding general of the U.S. forces in Japan. They provided us a really, really great support. And I learned and I recognized that the importance of the true alliance. So at that time, I learned the word, a friend in need is a friend indeed. My conclusion is, true friend is the United States. So we have to develop this relationship more and more. Thank you very much.
Thank you, General Bansho, for that very comprehensive presentation. Professor Nakayama.
Well, thank you. It's really nice to be in LA. I was in Washington, D.C. more than 10 times last year. But I don't know when was the last time I visited the West Coast. It's really nice to be back, and I hope to sort of visit more often. I'm going to just, without all the niceties, I'm going to just go into my presentation in order to save time. Since General Bansho gave us the bigger picture, I'm going to focus more on how we perceive the Trump administration and the state of the, not just the alliance, but maybe the state of the US-Japan relations overall. I would say, and I think most of you would agree, that we have adapted to the Trump administration quite well. And if you look around the world, I would say there's 3 countries who is not totally, but mostly comfortable with the Trump administration. That is Israel, Saudi Arabia, and Japan, I would say. Now, I'm not being cynical. I think the answer, the reason why, is quite simple, because we don't have any other options, right? Put it simply. If you think about the situation in Northeast Asia, the issues that we're facing, General sort of Bansho explained to us, in a detailed manner, the issues on Korean Peninsula, and in a sort of a more midterm to longer term challenge is the uncertain and recently more sort of worrying rise of China. And I said we don't have any other options, but fortunately for us, the US option, among the all other realistic options, it's the best options. So we do not hesitate in embracing Mr. Trump. If situations goes out of control on the Korean Peninsula, there will be an all-out regional war. There's a possibility for that. And if you pile up what China is doing recently in our region, you clearly see a hegemonic ambition, which is not desirable. Not that we're anti-China or anything. It is not desirable for our region, I think. But unfortunately, we cannot deal with these situations alone. We need a partner. So after considering all other options, we believe that US-Japan alliance remains the most viable options that we have. So, whoever the president is, whoever you choose, he's the one that we have to deal with. And from our standpoint, you collectively chose Mr. Trump, and we can't vote in your election. So we would have no other option to adopt. Was this a smooth transition? I don't think so. On the day of the election, we were shocked, surprised, as many of you were, I think. And we always complain in the past US presidential elections, that US candidates talk about China and other issues, but never mention Japan. We were always complaining that. But this was, 2016 was like a be careful what you wish for kind of situation, right? And Mr. Trump said that, Japan is a free rider in terms of security. that you have to pay in order for Japan to be protected. And the second message was that Japan is in the same category with China and Mexico. You are a cheater. And the third was, I mean, to be fair to Mr. Trump, he said this only once, but this is at the heart of the alliance and the extended deterrence. He said that Japan can go nuclear if you want. Right? So this was a very shocking message. So when we heard of the result of the election, we were shocked. Right? I was on live television, and I literally lost words. I stopped talking for 10, 20 minutes. And I would like to commend the Prime Minister's office and Ministry of Foreign Affairs. They were really flexible in adapting to the situation. They sort of reached a conclusion that they'd have to sort of change their minds and work with this new president. That resulted in the November meeting between President-elect Trump and Prime Minister Abe. And of course, in February, Prime Minister visited Washington and then to Mar-a-Lago and dined 5 times, played 28 holes of golf together. And I was surprised to hear Consul General Chiba mentioning that they've talked 18 times on the telephone, meant 5 times. Not just at the presidential level. Vice President Pence has visited Japan 2 times. Mattis, Tillerson, McMaster, we are having a very close coordination, contact with these people. So for the Trump team, they're not the most popular administration around the world. So I think Japan is a very valuable alliance partner. As a result of that, you see a bit strange, but then again, very strong Trump optimism in Japan. But in the background, there's President Obama factor that I'd have to go into. Right? Among the general public, President Obama was very liked, very respected. His visit to Hiroshima was historic. Right? It was like enemies reaching full and true reconciliation. And it was a historic example. Right? And close to 95% of the Japanese people appreciated President Obama's visit to Hiroshima. In a way, you could say that he's established a very intimate bond with the Japanese people, which no other American president had ever done. Or even maybe with a Japanese political leader. A Japanese political leader can match sort of the respect that President Obama earned, to a certain degree. But there's a big but here. It is that, and it may be a surprise to you, but among the foreign policy and security experts, President Obama's reputation was not that good in Japan. We know, and I know, that he has a very sophisticated view of the world. Some people say that he's just a good speaker, talker. I don't think so. When you listen to his speech and when you listen to his interviews, you see the deep thinking, in him. And so he's not just a good talker or a good speaker. But the issue here is that a speculative thinker or whatever, a philosopher, is that a good condition or a good, could that kind of person be a good commander-in-chief? Maybe those two doesn't really match. So when he was talking about Russia, he said Russia is not an existential threat to the United States. And although he didn't mention China, for us, it sort of implied that China is not an existential threat either. Well, it may not be. He also said that Islamic State, although they may attack the United States, is not an existential threat to the United States. And by the same extension, we thought he was referring to DPRK to a certain degree, although he didn't explicitly say so. What he said was an existential threat to the United States was issues such as pandemic or global warming, which is true, I think. But for us, who's facing a real security threat from North Korea, and facing an uncertain and China with hegemonic ambitions, and U.S. president saying that a threat to the United States is a pandemic and global warming, it didn't really resonate. So there was, I would say, not a deep but strong suspicion towards President Obama. But more importantly, I think the weight of President Obama's word. In terms of this lightness of presidential statement, President Trump has taken this to a totally different level, and I guess no one can argue with this. But in terms of international commitment, President Obama had some problems as well. Of course, the red line sort of issue in Syria, and his reaction to Russian invasion to Ukraine and Crimea. And we all know that Syria and Ukraine is not a US ally, and the context of the issue is totally different from what we're facing in Northeast Asia. But at the same time, if you add the fact that he's not seeing, or what his view of pandemic and global warming being existential threat, and all that, there was this worry that can we really trust this president's word in times of contingency? Right? To be fair to him and his team, in terms of management of the alliance, he said all the right things. And I think he supported all the initiative taken by Prime Minister Abe in terms of our security infrastructure and security policy. So I would commend President Obama and his team for that. But that didn't really dealt with the worries that we had about presidential commitment. And then we suddenly had President Trump last year. We were all talking about what would happen if Mr. Trump becomes president, and we were all worried that alliance would be no more. It would not function. But as it turns out, situation in Northeast Asia, the threat we're facing is quite obvious. And I think it was easy for a non-expert like Mr. Trump to understand who is your enemy and who is your friend. So that, I think, benefited Japan very well. And of course, this personal chemistry between Prime Minister Abe, because personal chemistry element in President Trump thinking is quite important, that this personal chemistry worked out quite fine. So as a result of all that, our sort of decision was to stop complaining, double down on the alliance and Mr. Trump. So therefore the February meeting, and he basically repeated that when Mr. Trump visited Japan. And am I personally proud of that? I might not be, but I think Prime Minister Abe did the right decision as a commander-in-chief of Japan, in light of the fact that the difficult situation that we're facing in Northeast Asia. Then the issue is, do we feel totally secure? Are we okay now? I don't think so. I would say that we're so far so good, but we don't know what's going to happen really tomorrow. I think, as a scholar of, by the way, I teach American politics and foreign policy to the Japanese students, and that's a difficult task these days because you don't know what's really going on. Right? And the students all know that I was totally wrong about the election because because I said the other side would win all the time. But anyhow, as a scholar of American politics, I do think Mr. Trump's worldview and his view on politics is very worrying. I just saw his speech in CPAC, Conservative Political Action Conference in DC, and he did the snake speech again. Right? If you haven't seen it, you should go over it. He hasn't changed. He's the same old Mr. Trump. And America is very strong when united, but Mr. Trump is clearly sowing division here in the United States. Yes, President Obama accelerated division as well, but that wasn't his intention. But for Mr. Trump, I think division is his source of energy. And and according to this foreign policy article that I saw, 35 of the so-called experts think that there will be a civil war, not in terms of people taking up guns and shooting each other, but 35% of the experts would maybe like in the 60s type of civil war. Right? 35% of the experts think that there will be a civil war in the coming 10 years. I don't know whether that's true or not, but that's a very surprising number. So when America decides to take an action, a very important action, abroad, the fact that domestically you're totally divided is not good. And in terms of foreign policy, it's not as disastrous as we thought. I think there's some issues like TPP, Paris Agreement and all that, but not disastrous. But I think it's not because Mr. Trump has matured as commander-in-chief or president. I think it's because the main players of the Trump administration, the foreign policy team, the MMTs, the McMaster, Tillerson, and Mattis, they are trying to secure Trump foreign policy from President Trump. I think that's the reason why Mr. Trump's or Trump administration's foreign policy is not disastrous. As long as this MMT firewall is functioning, I think it's totally okay. But we're not quite sure how long this is going to continue. We always hear about the talk rumors about Tillerson and McMaster being difficulties with Mr. Trump. Mr. Mattis seems okay. And I feel safe with that. But most of all, U.S.-Japan relations is not just about the military alliance. It's more broader than that. It has economic ties, cultural ties, personal ties. It's a relation at a multi-dimensional level. Most of all, it's a relations between two very matured democracies, I think. So if a young Japanese would look at Mr. Trump and see him as the leader of your country, like my son is 10 years old, and he's bombarded with the scene of Mr. Trump making speeches, would that have a good effect psychologically on Japanese youngsters? Would they be able to see United States as we do, that our generation did? I don't know. I don't want to be too pessimistic, but under the Trump administration, U.S.-Japan relations, so far so good, and I hope it would continue. But U.S.-Japan relations and alliance also is not a standalone institution. It has to resonate with a comprehensive American Asia-Pacific policy, which is, as of now, missing. Right? So we feel fine with our relations, but we feel very insecure about the lack of comprehensive engagement by the United States to our region. So I hope that things will turn out well, and I don't want to end with a pessimistic note, but I think I've used up all my time, so I'll end my remarks here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Matthew Goodman.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you to the Japan-America Society, Doug and colleagues, and to all the supporting organizations. And I bring fraternal and sororal greetings from the Japan-America Society of Washington, D.C., which I'm privileged to be the chairman of the board of, and we are delighted to be represented here in this forum. And I will try to be brief, but I had to sort of tear up my notes here because Ida-san knows in the journalism world there's something called burying the lead. And what that means is not talking initially about the most important topic, but sort of burying it deep in the story. And so I was going to start by talking about the U.S.-Japan economic relationship, but I think in my world, the story today is the thing that Ida-san alluded to, that the president said this morning about his intention to impose tariffs on imports of steel and aluminum, 25% tariffs on steel imports from anywhere in the world and 10% on aluminum imports for an unstated indefinite period. He may or may not actually do that. Just in the last 24 hours, that news has whipsawed back and forth from no announcement to that announcement to some other announcement. So who knows where this will actually turn out. But if you take that seriously, that's what he's going to do, it is a really big story. And it deserves to be in the first paragraph, because this will be one of the first times we've used this provision of law, which is a part of our trade law that goes back to the Cold War, that was intended to deal with imports that might be a threat to national security. And that law has very rarely been used. It was last deployed in 2001 on a much different set of issues. Using this provision has at least 4 sets of problems. Number one is that it's going to raise the cost of imported steel and aluminum for everybody, starting with other manufacturers who use steel and aluminum in their imports, in their products. And that's ultimately going to spill down to the rest of us. So I don't know if anybody is drinking a Coke or a beer out of an aluminum can, but if you are, you're going to pay more for your can of Coke or beer because of this action if it goes through. So it is problematic in terms of cost. It's problematic in terms of jobs, because it's ostensibly designed to save jobs, and it may save some jobs in the steel and aluminum sector in the United States, but it's much more likely to cost jobs on a net basis because of that downstream effect. When President Bush, 43, imposed similar measures for about a year, it's estimated that may have cost as much as 200,000 net jobs. And that was just a temporary measure. So there's that cost. Then there's the problem, thirdly, that it is going to, it's a shotgun effect, not a targeted rifle effect. It's going to hit a lot of sellers of steel and aluminum to the United States. If you go down the list of the top exporters, or from our point of view, importers of steel and aluminum, number 1 is Canada, number 2 is Brazil, number 3 is South Korea. You go down the list, number 7 is Japan, and you go down to number 10 and you don't find China in that list. China is the number 11 seller of steel to the United States. And so you got to get through 10 other countries that are going to have to pay these higher tariffs. That's going to have implications, because several of those countries, including Japan and South Korea, are allies of the United States. So how are we going to deal with that? Actually, this is one reason why I actually don't think that this result is going to stand. I think that probably there are going to be some exemptions. But meanwhile, we've just signaled to our allies that we're willing to impose this cost on them. So that has implications. And then finally, the use of this national security provision is really problematic, because the fact is the U.S. Defense Department uses only about 3% of U.S. steel production. So there isn't a real, at least identifiable problem there. And what this is going to do is it's going to encourage other countries to use national security as an excuse to take protectionist measures. So I think it's got some pretty significant ramifications, and those include for Japan, and that's why I think it's, apart from the fact that I think it's the biggest story in the trade world today, it also has implications for this conversation. So I wanted to start with that and say that, I find it a significant story for the day. But let me now talk about what I was supposed to talk about quickly, which is the U.S.-Japan economic relationship itself. And I would say, apart from that, I would say actually it's pretty good. I would agree with the previous speakers that I'm pretty positive, very positive about our economic relationship. I think Prime Minister Abe has done a masterful job of winning President Trump's trust, despite the fact that, for 30 years, and you alluded to it, Nakayama-sensei, that during the campaign he referred back to an sort of early and well-established view in his mind about Japanese trade and economic practices in particular, going back 30 years. And despite that view, which he still seems to hold, he now has a great confidence and trust, I think, in Prime Minister Abe, and I think that means that the risk to Japan of some sort of trade problem, other than the one I just mentioned, but that one at least was not, I think, deliberately aimed at Japan. I think that the risk of a targeted action at Japan is very low right now. That said, Japan is not entirely out of risk. Again, I mentioned one example, but even in a sort of possibility of some deliberate policy change is possible because Japan is uncomfortably the second largest source of bilateral trade deficits for the United States. China is far and away the biggest bilateral deficit, about $375 billion last year. But Japan's $70 billion, which is still a pretty big number in Mr. Trump's mind. Doesn't bother me as an economist, but it bothers him. So I think that there's a risk there for Japan. If something else goes wrong, Japan could be seen as somehow, again, an unfair, ungrateful ally that is taking advantage of the United States in trade. So there is a bit of a risk, but I don't think that's an immediate problem. I think that for now, the relationship's very good and very positive. We have a dialogue between us, between Deputy Prime Minister Aso and Vice President Pence on economic issues, and it has 3 pillars, which include managing these trade and investment challenges, because there's still concerns about market access in Japan for agriculture and automobiles in particular. But the other 2 pillars are much more constructive about sort of working on macroeconomic and financial issues, and then working on third country cooperation. And that's the one that I think is the most promising, and the one that I think you'll find much of the real value in our bilateral economic relationship going forward, where we work together on third country issues, including things like energy, infrastructure, and broadly, I would say, rule making and norm setting in the world. That hasn't been something that President Trump had initially shown much interest in, but I think as his concerns about China are rising, I think that there is a greater interest in Washington, and I think an opportunity here for the U.S. and Japan to work together on rulemaking and norm setting, including, shocking enough to all of us, the possibility that the United States might actually return to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, this trade agreement among 12 Asia-Pacific countries that was agreed in late 2015, and which the U.S. was working to pass through Congress when, after the election, President Trump, or when he became president, not his actual first action, but one of his first actions was to walk away or to tear up our participation in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, keeping a campaign promise, because he had made some very strong statements about TPP. He's now indicated at Davos, when he was there 3 times, so it wasn't an accident, he said 3 times that we might rejoin TPP under the right conditions if the agreement were improved. And now there have been various cabinet members who have alluded to this, and so everybody's sort of scrambling around trying to figure out if this is going to happen. I actually don't think so in the short term. I think in the long term it will happen, or we will rejoin some sort of high standard trade arrangement, but I think in the short term it's unlikely, certainly before the midterms. But at least there's a conversation going, and that sort of is, I think, a sign of the administration's understanding that we have to work together on things like high standard rulemaking in trade, but also in infrastructure and other things. So I'll end by just saying one final thing, which is about Japan's external economic diplomacy. So I've been following Japan for exactly 35 years this month. I was a baby when I started, but literally arrived in March of 1983. And I have never until the last year seen Japan as bold and effective in its external economic diplomacy. The fact that Japan led, and it wasn't Australia or Singapore, it was Japan that led the other 11 TPP members to complete a revised deal, and that's going to be signed next week down in Chile, was amazing. I mean, eyebrow raising to me that Japan was able to pull that off. Also, Japan negotiated a trilateral statement between the European Union, the United States, and Japan last December in Buenos Aires on the margins of a WTO meeting to take on overcapacity and forced technology transfer issues. The word China was not mentioned in this statement, but it was clearly about China, and that was Japan's initiative. Japan drove this. Also, Japan has proposed a concept of quality infrastructure investment in the world. And this term is a Japanese phrase that has been now adopted by the United States, and it is clearly, again, designed to provide an alternative to the Chinese Belt and Road and China's approach to infrastructure investment. And more broadly, that this falls in the U.S. Framework, and I'll end actually where Nakayama-san was about the lack of a U.S. strategy in the Asia-Pacific. I actually agree with that. There isn't enough there, and including on trade. We don't have a trade agenda there in the Asia-Pacific, but at least we have a bumper sticker now called the Free and Open Indo-Pacific, which is the phrase that Secretary Tillerson, when he was at CSIS last October, raised. And this was a Japanese term which he assumed as a concept for to sort of govern our approach to this broad region. And I think it's a good bumper sticker, it's a good headline, but it needs a lot of fleshing out and a lot of detail underneath it. That isn't there yet. But again, a tribute to Japan for having convinced the Trump administration to take that on board and make it the organizing principle of our engagement in the region. So this to me is really, I mean, I'd say not today's headline, but I would say this year's headline for me as a Japan watcher is how Japan has stepped up and really shown leadership in diplomacy broadly, but I think specifically in economic diplomacy, and that's really something that I'm watching closely because it's a very significant development. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much for setting the stage for us. I do want to revisit the trade issue, but since we're on the West Coast, and I think a lot of people are concerned on the peninsula, the Korean peninsula issue, I just want to dive into North Korea. And I'd like to ask General Bansho, in your presentation, you had the word, prepare for the worst, hope for the best. That was not in the context of North Korea. But if we put it into the context of North Korea, what would be the worst situation and the best situation?
First of all, North Korean situation is a directly and a serious threat to the security of Japan. So not only for the nowadays, but also we continuously watch the situation. As I explained, as of the Korean War in 1950s, that is the origin of a Japanese rearmament, the organization of the armed forces for Japan. So North Korean situation is critically important and a direct threat. And as of your questions, worst scenario is maybe a happening of the war. But I think there is a variety of the situation, I think. But I mentioned before, the core of this issue or center of gravity of the North Korean situation is North Korea is trying to develop the nuclear capabilities and long-range missile capabilities. That is the core of this situation. So if North Korea gave up and abandoned such kind of weapons, the situation will be solved immediately. But maybe they not. The worst case scenario might be we have to expect from high-intensity conflicts such as the war happened. So that is my answer.
What do you expect from a South-North dialogue or a North-U.S. dialogue?
Indeed, dialogue is very important, but that is not purpose. Look at the recent Olympic seasons, the movement, especially the smiling diplomacy from North Korea. I thought that is a kind of the tactics for three purposes. One is the divide of the trilateral link between Japan, US, and South Korea. especially South Korea, might be removed from Japan and US ties. Another one is reduce the pressure of the international community. As you know, UN sanction is going now, but such kind of image will freeze and reduce such kind of image. And third is to gain the timing or distance for developing the missile capabilities and nuclear capabilities. So we should not be understood the North Korean attitude.
Professor Nakayama, General Bansho said a war might happen. You, in your original presentation, talked about an all-out regional war. What do you expect moving forward from both Japan and the U.S.?
Well, I think if you look at the situation on Korean Peninsula, we can't really foresee a realistic, good scenario. There's bad scenarios, even more better scenarios, and the worst scenarios, right? So it's a very complicated and difficult situation, and we don't see the way out at the moment, I think. But if you ask the Japanese public, are you ready to live with a nuclear, and with its capability to launch that nuclear weapon with a missile? Are you willing to live with that kind of country for the coming 20, 30, 40 years? Definitely no. No Japanese would be able to accept that kind of situation. So I understand that maximum pressure doesn't really show you the way out, but at the same time, it's the only option. Coordinated international maximum pressure is the only realistic option that we can foresee. That doesn't mean that we would exclude all possibilities of dialogue. It has to be there. But as General Bansho said, it cannot be for talking for the sake of talking. It has to be to realize getting rid of nuclear weapons and missiles as well. And I understand some people say that because we don't see a way out, there has to be a dialogue. But it's important to know that we have tried dialogue many times. And in all the cases, we were deceived by the North Koreans, and it bought them time. And the result is the situation that we have now. So dialogue in itself is not the answer. You have to go back and learn 20 years of history of negotiations. And in terms of ROK Korea, there's a strong Korea fatigue sentiment in Japan, and that Korea seems to be tilting both in China, US, and trying to leave Japan out. But I think we have to be diligent and try to keep Korean on our side and somehow manage this trilateral relations. Unless we do that, we will never have a successful sort of conclusion of this process. So I think this focus on US, ROK, Japan, trilateral coordination is something that we have to focus on to deal with this issue.
For those of us who are not familiar with this Korea fatigue sentiment, can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, there's many components to it. In terms of geopolitics, it seems as though from us, in thinking about Korea's future, whether China is important, Japan is important, they seem to say publicly that China is much more important for their future. They still see the importance of the United States. But with China and Japan, at least from our point of view, they seem to tilt towards China. But from our point of view, Koreans emphasize the importance of US-ROK alliance, but US-ROK alliance could only function when there's a stable US-Japan alliance. So it's virtually a trilateral alliance. But Koreans do not admit, are willing to accept that. So, that kind of, out of the reality geopolitical recognition is something that we're not happy with. And of course, I'm not going to delve into this, but there's always the history issue. Mm-hmm. Our sense is that they keep on moving the goalpost. That's the popular term that we use these days. But, there's a strong Korean fatigue that no matter what we do, you can't basically change the mindset of the Korean people. But I think on our side, we have to try to avoid getting into that mindset and somehow, try to, sort of come out with a better, Seoul, Tokyo sort of bilateral relationship.
Matthew, can you talk about the atmosphere in Washington these days with regards to North Korea?
There's worry, as I think General Bancho said. We're also within range of these missiles, and so we share even that concern. But certainly, from a policy point of view, there's it's topic one in foreign policy, and I think there is a. I'm not an expert in this area, so I don't want to go too far in commenting on to characterize the debate exactly. But I do think there is a general sense that is now, I think, probably almost universally held that there is not an acceptable preemptive military response to this action that's going to, in a cost-benefit sense, be successful. So I think that the notion that was being talked about for a while about a bloody nose strategy of a short strike, targeted strike, has been largely dismissed, and I think most strategic experts think this would not be realistic or viable. There are still, I think, some in the national security community, including in the Trump administration, who still think that there may be an option there. But I think the overwhelming view is that isn't a realistic option. But the status quo is also not acceptable, and so I think that it sort of points you inevitably to some sort of process of dialogue, discussion, attempt to try to resolve this through other means, through diplomatic means. So I think that's what people are trying to figure out exactly what that means, what the terms would be, how we would, what kinds of conditions we would have to have before we would actually go into those talks. But it feels like we're headed towards some sort of process, unlikely as that is to really, in the short term, fundamentally resolve the problem. But I think that that's what people are exploring now.
Do you think economic sanctions...
And meanwhile, putting sanctions, I should have...
Well, do you think sanctions work? Because you all talked about putting maximum pressure on North Korea. I was in Washington during the Banco Delta Asia Days. Sanctions, do they actually work? Because President Trump issued a new sanction last week. Do you think this works?
Well, there's mixed evidence or mixed analysis of that. I haven't done my own study of sanctions, but having read the literature, I think that there's mixed evidence on this historically. I think that it is clearly, but in the case of North Korea, as you said, with Banco Delta, there was evidence that did have an impact. Whether it fundamentally changed the dynamic is another question, but it did seem to get the old Kim regime's attention. And I think if used in an appropriate way with everyone participating or people who are not sticking to the sanctions line being held to account, it could have an impact. At least it's, again, something that there is some talk and evidence that maybe the Kim regime is feeling a little bit of heat, and that's why you saw the flirtation with some sort of discussion during the Olympics, although that didn't pan out, but that may be a sign that the sanctions are beginning to bite on the Kim regime. But who knows?
General Bansho, in your presentation, you showed us photos of the missile tests from North Korea. They haven't tested since last November. What sign do you think this is signaling?
Yes, the last launch of the Fason 15th was conducted on the November 29th. So since then, they didn't launch another missiles. But I think that is a not good sign.
Oh, what's that?
For example, in order to demonstrate their capabilities, they conducted several missiles. For example, Fason 12, that is the September, end of August and mid of September. That is a normal shooting over Japan. But Fason 14th, that is the launched on the July 4th, U.S. Independence Day, and the end of the July. And Fason 15th, that is the end of the November. That is a lofted launch. That is an actual test should be needed for them. So if so, they are going to seek the another opportunity. And as of the nuclear warhead itself, is also maybe developing. So if they are going to realize the armament of such kinds of weapons, they need such kind of the testing with normal range and the nuclear warhead testing. So I think that is not a good sign. And they just wanted to gain the time. I think so.
Before I switch gear to trade, I wanted to ask Professor Nakayama, there's many business leaders here. We've been talking about a very cautious scenario of North Korea. How do businesses, do you think, should be prepared for the situation?
For contingency on the peninsula?
Yeah.
Well, that's a difficult one.
That's why I'm asking you.
Well, the immediate issue that we have, at least that the many Japanese corporations have, and I guess the U.S. corporation for that matter, is how to evacuate, your fellow workers who's working in Seoul and South Korea. And for Japan especially, there are difficulties because of the past history and the war and the occupation of Japan. That the South Korean people are very uncomfortable about Japanese military planes flying into their own land. So the issue of evacuation hasn't been. I don't know what's going on at the governmental level, but as far as we know, that there's some theories that they have to come down south by themselves. I'm talking about the Japanese nationals. Some could get on the American military planes, maybe sending a civilian plane, but that would be extremely difficult under if the fire is being exchanged. So that's, I guess, the immediate challenge that each corporations are facing. And I'm sure that you're sort of working out some scenarios for that. And I hope the government is working on that. The Self-Defense Force, Ministry of Defense, and Ministry for Affairs, and Prime Minister's Office. But for more actual advice, I'm not an economist, and maybe Mr. Goodman has more better advice. I'm sorry to give the floor to you, but I don't have any. I'm not a business person, and I'm not an economist. So I don't have any specific advice that I can give you.
Okay. And I'm going to ask Matthew, not about North Korea, but on trade. I understand that Japan might be exempted, but does this new measure, will this trigger a trade war between, like, for instance, China?
Well, I generally try to avoid the term trade war because I'm not sure what that means, and I think it can often be, it's a nice sort of short two-syllable way of capturing a complicated problem. I mean, we had a lot of tension with Japan in the 1980s and early 90s, and people threw around the term trade war, but I wouldn't characterize what happened at that time as a war. I think it was, a lot of elevated tension, and I think that's what is the most likely thing that's going to happen with China. I think if we move forward with these sanctions, I think not only China, but some of the other people on that list who aren't exempted may end up retaliating against us, and that's going to potentially cause a kind of cycle of retaliation. I think with respect to China, if we do something more targeted at China, they will almost certainly retaliate. That's been their practice in the past. Some of that will be legal and filing WTO cases and so forth, but it will also, some of it will be informal, and so I'm expecting that, talking about businesses preparing, I imagine that in the boardrooms of, Boeing Corporation and Archer Daniel Midlands, or folks selling agricultural products to China, that they're probably talking about contingencies if we move forward. China, those are the kinds of targets that will be hit, and then there's a question of how do we get out of this, or who's going to stand down first. That question is actually something we are studying now. We're actually trying to game out a escalation scenario, but don't have the answer yet. We'll see. It may play out before we have the answer. But I don't think I think a war. I think nobody has an interest in getting into a cycle of retaliation that would sort of slide us into a 1930s-style protectionist outcome. So I think we'll stop short of that. But I think elevated tension is very likely.
Do you think Japan should go to the WTO for dispute settlement if this actually happens?
I think if Japan feels that its WTO rights have been violated by this action, and there would be a case for that, then I would advise the Japanese government to file a case. That's the way the system works, and I think that would be an appropriate response. In fact, a better response than, as I say, what I think China is likely to do, which is to mix probably some of that formality with much more less formal measures. So I think Japan would have a right to do that, and I actually think in Washington that would be respected. I mean, it would be a problem, and it would be something we'd have to resolve. But I don't think it would. I don't think it would be as damaging as some Japanese may fear if it's done properly through the proper procedures.
Just one more follow-up. I understand the Chinese top economic official is in Washington. What message does this send to him?
Yeah, so this top advisor, really the top economic advisor to President Xi Jinping, Liu He, is in Washington as we speak. And I don't think that the decision or the announcement about steel and aluminum had anything to do with his being there. I don't think it was deliberately intended to send a signal to him. I think that just there wasn't attention paid to the implications of that. And I think that it will be noticed, however, by Mr. Liu, I'm sure, and I think that it will probably make it more difficult for him. I think he's in Washington to try to see if there's some sort of package of things that China could give the U.S. to resolve this issue, to reestablish a formal dialogue, because we've suspended the main forum, the Comprehensive Economic Dialogue, the CED, between the two sides. And so I think the Chinese are trying to reestablish something like that. This will make it much harder to reach some sort of deal.
Professor Nakayama, this year's 2018. It's an election year. You talked about.
I'm not going to talk anymore about elections.
Well, no, you were talking about Japan, China. Well, actually, China, Mexico, and Japan all bundled together, and being called a cheater the last time. Do you fear that Japan, China, and Mexico will become a punching bag for Mr. Trump again?
I don't think so, because you see the chemistries between the two leaders. And talking, it's only been a year, and the fact that they've talked 18 times and they met 5 times, and they seem totally comfortable. Mm-hmm. And I think the personal factor plays a very big role, good or bad, in Mr. Trump's sort of dealing with the world. So maybe in some stump speeches in, Rust Belt, Ohio, somewhere, he might repeat that message. But I don't think it's going to be a serious policy message, and I don't think Japan should overreact to it either.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I would say I don't think it's very likely that, well, actually, caveat with Mr. Trump one never knows what he's going to say on any given day. So it's possible, but I don't think it's likely that he's going to make a broad, or he's going to categorize Japan with China and Mexico. But he may well have a more targeted message about certain sectors. I mean, just this week, earlier this week, he made a statement to the National Governors Association about Japanese auto standards and environmental and safety standards that are problematic for sales of U.S. cars in Japan. He is likely to go after, the agriculture issues as well as a targeted thing. But that's part of the game. I don't think that, again, I agree, Japan shouldn't overreact to that.
One day you might be praised on Twitter, the next day you might be criticized on Twitter.
You never know.
So that's a warning to the media people that you will almost likely to overreact.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what we do. That's our job, to overreact. I'd like to open the floor up for questions, and please raise your hand if you have a question, and please tell us who you are, who your question is addressed to, and please put a question mark at the end, no statement, please. This is kind of,
Sorry, the first
wonderful.
one's always the hardest. Then,
My name is John.
Can you use the microphone, please?
Okay. My name is John Dratz. I'm an attorney in basically semi-retired, would like to be totally retired attorney in Los Angeles. And I have a question about North Korea. It seems like the Kim regime has said that one of their reasons for having their nuclear weapons is for deterrence. And it seems to be working to me, because everybody's afraid of them all of a sudden. And all of these other countries that have nuclear weapons, that's their same rationale. China, Russia, India, Pakistan, I think, has nuclear weapons as well. And I can see why Kim might see some of these countries as threats, and I can see why Japan might see some of these countries as threats too. So I think that we should consider, or I think it's a fact, that Kim is not going to give up those nuclear weapons. And what do we do going forward if what I said was correct? And I don't have that addressed to anybody in particular.
Well, I guess I should ask General Bansho, what happens if Kim Jong-un does not give up his nuclear weapons?
Number one, we never accept the armament of nuclear weapons by North Korea. So we continuously seek them to give up those armaments. This is very important. With international effort, I'm afraid of the violation of the NPT regime. If some ideas that limited acceptance of the North Korean weapons, nuclear weapons, and armament, if the North Korean technology of the nuclear weapons will transfer to the Middle East or terrorists, how can we imagine the world? So we never accept it. And we have to force to North Korea to give up. This is the core of this thing, I think. So, so far, we have to keep pressure to them. And if not so, American high-ranking officials always said every options on the table. So we have to expect the worst scenario. This is my answer. Thank you.
Just to follow up to General Bansho, the Olympics, the Pyeongchang Olympics has ended. Then we're having the Paralympics, and I understand after that there'll be a resumption of the military exercises between the U.S. and South Korea. Do you think that will be business as usual? Do you think it'll happen as usual? Do you think it might be reduced in size, maybe, or maybe no cameras? Do you think there will be some kind of consideration towards North Korea?
I think this exercise will be conducted as scheduled and as same size as planned. If reduced, or if delayed, it's postponed, that will become a wrong message to North Korea. They will be misunderstood. So we have the based on the pressure, as well as the economic sanction, based on the military pressure, should be sent.
Okay. Any more questions? Oh, the gentleman in the front.
Dean Park from Loyola Marymount University. Thank you for very interesting presentations. So one question that I have is that I didn't hear anything about Russia in Northeast Asia and looking at the larger security situation. So my question is, where does Russia fit in, if at all, and to what extent? For a while, it looks like Abe and Putin were on this path to having a better relationship, but then more recently, Russia announced that they were going to employ warplanes to an airstrip on one of the disputed islands, Etsurofu, or in Itrup, I guess is how it's said in Russian. So is there any potential for Russia to potentially cause trouble in the region, and how might it involve Japan's national interests? Thank you.
Professor Nakayama, do you want to take that?
Well, I'm no expert on Russia, but generally speaking, I think the perception of Russia in Japan and in our region isn't as negative as in Europe, quite naturally, because they're not a direct or immediate geopolitical threat. They have their own sort of Asia-Pacific rebalance. They're trying to be an active player in the region. Although their presence is not that big, Japan's, in terms of energy, the territory issues is always tough. But the Prime Minister's office and Prime Minister Abe personally is putting an effort to manage and have a good relations with Putin and the Russian government in general. That creates a bit of a difficulty. That did create a bit of a difficulty during the Obama era, because Obama was quite. Well, I'm sort of contradicting what I'm said, because he was soft on Ukraine and Crimea, but he did not have good relations with Putin. And there was a bit of a worry that there was a dissonance between U.S. approach to Russia and the Japanese approach to Russia. But now, fortunately or unfortunately, although the national security establishment is seeing Russia as a major threat, Mr. Trump doesn't seem to share that idea, right? He had done nothing with the sort of the election meddling and all that. So I don't hear this dissonance that often. And of course, quite naturally, how we see Russia and how the Americans see Russia could be different. So that difference in itself has not become a political issue under the Trump administration. So I think we're diligently trying to pursue. Not that we share values, it's not the same type of relations we have with countries like United States, Australia, or India. It's a different kind of relationship. It's more geopolitical, managing the problems. But we are trying to seek for some possibility in the Japan-Russia relations.
General Bansho, building on that, how concerned is the Japanese self-defense force on Russia?
As I explained by my slide, during the Cold War, we call it the Nordic analogy. It means northern areas is very important, because in order to cope with the Soviet Union's armed forces. But now the situation is changing. The strategic front in the Korean Peninsula and the East China Sea front is emerging for our important areas to be prepared. So we don't want to three strategic front, actually. And listen to good news and bad news. Good news is recent relationship between the Russia and Japan, especially the relationship between our Prime Minister Abe and President Putin, have a very close relationship and keep negotiation or keep a relationship. That is a good sign. And thanks to that relationship, we continuously engage the dialogue with the Russian military and us. So this kind of engagement or confidence building measures might be very important. But bad news is still we have to pay attention to the North, because recent activities of the northern areas, still they continuously conducting the air patrol by aircraft or large-size exercises, and the newly deployment of the modernized weapons on Northern Territory, and constructing the new bases. So their military activities is not so low level to accelerate it. So hedging to deter or to prepare for the Russia, but at the same time, we have to keep continuous relationship and engagement with Russia. That is very important.
Thank you very much. Any more questions? In the middle, please.
Right. Hi, I'm Jun. I'm from the Lower Marymount. So my main question is, considering the past sanctions during the Bush and Obama have really not worked. A lot of folks say that North Korea gaining nuclear weapon is inevitable. What kind of strategy should what kind of new strategy should U.S. and Japan take on countering the North Korean threat? And you have mentioned that the past peace process have failed. So what can we learn from our past mistakes, and what can we do better in the future diplomatic talks? Thank you.
Matthew, I'm going to ask you to start with that. What new strategies? I mean, you can talk about sanctions, you can talk about the atmosphere in Washington, but what do you think is needed for
I don't know. I
strategy?
mean, this is not an issue I work on sort of day to day, so I don't have a lot of brilliant new ideas on this. I mean, I think that the combination of using pressure and seeking diplomatic engagement that doesn't compromise our basic principles, like not accepting North Korea's preservation of their nuclear capability, or certainly using it, is I think the right combination of things, but and keeping options on the table, but not using them. I think it's going to require patience and persistence, trying to get as many people on board as possible. But that's all stuff that's been tried before. It's not new. So the question is, whether we can apply that in a way that is more effective. I don't know.
Professor Nakayama, do you have a brilliant idea?
Well, pay attention to what Japan is going to do. We've got to beef up our missile defense system, buy more missile defense from the U.S. We're going to be talking about counter-strike capabilities. That's on the agenda right now. Constitutional reform is a bit different from that. It's not directly related to contingency on North Korea, but it has some implications. And you would surely be hearing, other noises. If, like, North Korea maintains its, missile capabilities and nuclear weapons, and if somehow the American Trump team would be satisfied just with getting rid of ICBMs, right, so that it won't reach the continental United States, but we would still be facing the threats. That's called the decoupling, right? There would be many voices in Japan. Some would maybe advocate for Japan going nuclear. I'm not for that, and that's not a majority voice, but you would certainly hear that kind of argument. So therefore, I mean, and if that is the course that we're going, it could end up in a arms race in Northeast Asia, could extremely destabilize. So you mentioned that maybe we should accept the fact that North Korea is trying to deter the attack against them. So it sort of sounded like being too aggressive to North Korea is a destabilizer. But I don't think so, because we cannot live with a nuclear weaponized North Korea. Japan would certainly react in some other way, and other countries would react in some other way. And that in itself would create a destabilizing factor. So I don't buy the argument that because Kim Jong-un's purpose is to deter attacks upon them, if we admit that, it could even be a stabilizing force. Mr. Kim's is a strategic thinker to a certain degree. I don't buy that argument. So I don't know where I'm going, but that's.
Got it. Thank you.
My name is Nick Connor. I'm a Trans-Pacific businessman, I guess, that's the description. Professor Nakayama, you mentioned the revision of the Constitution. Could you comment on where we are on that at the moment and what possible modifications that might cause to the U.S.-Japan general relationship?
I don't think it's going to have an impact on U.S.-Japan relationship, but the state of the argument now is that LDP is preparing a draft. There is no consensus yet. It's literally working on it. It was Prime Minister Abe's one of the most important personal agendas, but he has handed to the party to draft and come out with a proposition. And I believe it's going to be out in late March. And it's a modest adjustment to sort of acknowledging the existence of self-defense force, mainly. I'm just focusing on the Article 9. There are other parts. And other parts of amending the Constitution is not controversial, about the education, some sort of contingency situations when you cannot hold an election, can the politicians extend their term limit? Those issues, they're fine. But the contentious part is, of course, the Article 9. But the way that LDP is pursuing, and partly because of Komeito, because that's a dovish sort of, not a pacifist, but rather dovish party, they're seeking for a modest amendment. So there is a possibility, and that would not have sort of direct impact to U.S.-Japan alliance or U.S.-Japan relations. I think the U.S. position is that it's the Japanese people to decide. So I think that's the state of the process now.
Thank you. Lastly, I'd like to ask the three gentlemen to maybe 30 seconds, 40 seconds to give us your key takeaway from today. I'm going to start with Matthew, and Nakayama-san is going to have the last word.
Well, actually, I'm not going to give my key takeaway. Sorry, but I'm going to say something that I meant to say earlier when General Bansho showed the cherry blossoms. That's obviously very important to us in Washington, and so I invite you all to come to Washington and help us celebrate this because it has been 106 years since we first got the gift from Japan of the cherry blossoms around the tidal basin, and that's now spread everywhere, including, I guess you have some in Los Angeles as well. So that's wonderful. But I'm going to segue into Ambassador Schiefer by saying, to remind people that it's actually something else that has united the U.S. and Japan for 40 years longer than the cherry blossoms, and that is the sport of baseball. And he knows that, but I want to make sure everybody knows that baseball came to Japan in 1872. And so I think actually the rivalry between Washington and LA in baseball is the one to really watch. And I'm sorry for the Dodgers this year that the Nationals are going to take it all, but let the best team win.
Okay.
Thanks.
Last December, U.S. the White House issued the National Security Strategy, and last January, the Pentagon issued the National Defense Strategy. I was very pleased to read it because their objectives, the American objectives, American security concern, is quite so same as us, and we can share the values and we can share the strategic goals. So thanks to the U.S.-Japan alliance and thanks to your effort, we can share many values. And the most important thing is maybe coming 10 years, 20 years, to protect our status quo in this region. Status quo include freedom, democracy, or freedom of navigation, or freedom of trade, such kind of values we could share. So in order to protect such legitimacy or such kind of values, we have to protect it. And also, I think security or stability is not given by another people. We have to create it and we have to construct it. And US and Japan might be a core members. That's why I always remember the word I learned at the U.S. Forces Japan headquarters during the Cold War. That was a friend in need is friend in need. Thank you.
Professor Nakayama.
Seems like we're out of time, Mike.
No,
Is it okay? Okay. Well, I've been sort of stressing that Mr. Trump is different, somewhat strange and all that. But what I fear most is that, Mr. Trump may be totally normal. Right? What do I mean by that? If you try to distill Mr. Trump's sort of foreign policy message, I think you could sort of, boil it down to sort of three factors. And one is that, no more sort of needless interventions, right? That's the first pillar. And the second pillar is ask allies and partners to do more. And the third is nation building at home. We're going to do more at home, right? And this is Mr. Trump's three pillars, right? But this is exactly what President Obama was saying as well. No more intervention, ask allies to do more, and nation building at home, Obamacare. Right? So there's a clear continuity, despite a huge difference between personal characters and their demeanor and all that. And that might show a structural shift in American body politic about global commitment. That's even a scarier scenario. So I'd have to stress that, from the beginning of the 20th century, U.S. has been a functional player in East Asia. Although you're not geographically present, you're a functional player. So you still have to be, and you are still a very important resident power in Asia Pacific. And the best partner you have in that region is Japan. Period.
Thank you. Please join me in thanking the panelists for the wonderful discussion.